You see, someone's zip code, you see an accent, you see a skin tone, and your conditioning starts filling in the rest. This is how stereotypes get born. This is how bias hardens. This is how empathy disintegrates. What if the key to transformation lies in shifting your perspective? Hi, I'm Dr. Payal Beri. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives. Every conversation here is about one thing: how empathy changes the way we lead, connect, and create impact. Each episode, we get to explore deep, authentic conversations designed to expand your mindset. Whether you're looking to transform your leadership, deepen your relationships within your circle, your community, and friends, or gain clarity in your own personal growth, each episode will inspire you to see things differently and take action. If you're ready to challenge your thinking and embrace transformation, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. So the other day, a friend of mine called me really excited, and she wanted to tell me a story. And she then pauses herself and says, "Well, you're not a pet owner, so you probably won't care about the story. So you know what? Forget it. I'm not going to share." And I just started laughing and I said, "Wait, hold on. How come I wouldn't care? I know I'm not a pet owner and I don't have a dog, but that doesn't mean that I'm not interested in something, especially because you're clearly so happy about it. And if you're my friend and it matters so much to you, I want to know." But this happens so often. And I know you might be thinking, okay, Pyle, this is really silly. Why are you making a podcast episode that is about a pet story? But I promise you, it goes a lot deeper than this, because once you hear what I have to share, you're going to start noticing it too. Because this isn't the first time that I've heard something like this. And I promise you, it's not going to be the last time. And you're going to notice this too. Because as people, we do this all the time. We say things like, you know what? You're not a parent, so don't worry about it. You won't get it. Or, you know what? You don't really listen to that kind of music, or you're not interested in music anyway, so I'm not going to share with you about what just happened. Or, you know what? You're not religious, and so I'm not going to invite you to this event that we have going on, this specific holiday or celebration. And this happens so much. What it is self-protection. We're creating these spaces of, self-protection from getting hurt, from being vulnerable, from sharing too much when we think that that might be happening. And of course, because I am a curious nerd and I'm obsessed with understanding human behavior, my brain immediately starts to wonder, how did someone make a decision on my behalf or on anyone's behalf on what they're going to care about, what they're not going to care about? How did they decide if they wanted to bring me into a shared experience or pause themselves right there in that moment? And part of it is a prediction pattern that we have, but mostly it's a form of self-protection. And we do this a lot. And so, of course, my brain now goes down an entire rabbit hole of understanding the role of, do assumptions play a role in our community, in our relationships? What breaks relationships? What prevents vulnerability? What ruptures this? And I began asking myself the questions like, how many conversations are we editing before we even begin them? And how many connections and how many relationships are we cutting off or preventing from deepening because we told ourselves a story either about the other person, or maybe it's something about ourselves, or maybe it's because we've gone through that path before with someone else and now we're projecting it onto this new relationship. So how many times are we preventing from going deeper in relationships with someone because we've allowed assumptions to take priority over a shared experience? Yes, I'm not kidding. That one example of my friend calling me about the pet story literally took me down that rabbit hole. And I just really wanted to understand this because I'm someone who definitely prides myself on, my relationships with my friends, championing them. And so I just really needed to understand this. So yes, Welcome to the brain of an ADHD person who loves psychology, who studies human behavior, and is so fascinated by social behaviors. That's where my brain goes. So let's dive into this and let's really understand what this means. Because thing is, I also make assumptions. It's natural. I'm human. But I will also admit that assumptions get so under my skin. So, yes, I do get under my own skin, but I can't stand assumptions. It is just something that anytime someone uses it, I just cringe. And it's because I know and we know that making assumptions is the worst thing to do because more than likely it's not right, it's false. And we do this a lot. And why we do this and what causes us to make these assumptions and rupture these relationships? Well, technically, it's not really our fault. See, the thing is that our brains and the way that we need some form of categorization, understanding, navigating, situations, it's just a biological response that we have. I kind of compare it to if you guys are friends, lovers, I compare it to Monica Geller and how badly she needs to organize everything and she has this need for that and to predict things. Well, in a way, that's kind of like our brains. Our brains need to understand predictive behavior so that it's not using itself up for the same scenarios over and over again. It's going to see a scenario and it's going to assume, something. And it's like an algorithm, right? Like we just make these assumptions. But the thing is that we need that certainty. And so assumptions, even though false ones, they give us that control. It literally soothes us. So it's easier to stay blank than to ask. And it's easier to, just pause and easier to say, you know what, I know what this means rather than maybe saying, I don't know and I need clarification. Because to admit that we don't know something would cause another form of chaos in our minds and our emotions. It's where then the ego gets involved because now we have to admit that we don't know something and we have to talk about it. And oh my God, what's going to happen if we talk about it? But the cost of this is really steep. When we make assumptions, we stop being curious or interested. And because assumptions give us the answers and our brains relax and we say, okay, we don't need to do anything more about this. We're content. So we're okay. We don't need to go down, a conversation about this. We don't need to get curious. We feel soothed by it, even if we don't like whatever answers that we came up with. So then what happens is we stop connecting. And because what's the need? Well, I don't need to ask that question. I already know. And when I think of those moments where people just make assumptions, I realize, oh my gosh, we have built a whole culture and a whole community on quiet avoidance. Quiet avoidance is being comfortable without having to communicate. It's making decisions for yourself that just alleviates your stress, but you haven't actually resolved anything. And I really fear that our loneliness epidemic isn't actually helping, it's actually making it worse. And the fact that if we think about our younger generation and they have to take classes on how to pick up the phone, how to learn to socialize, these are things that there's actually classes on these. We're only deepening our assumption making and creating bigger divisions because we don't know how to have that conversation. We don't know how to actually alleviate some of those disappointments that we may have experienced in the past. And so when we're playing it safe instead of getting real, we're eliminating this closeness or this community. And we assume that someone doesn't want to hear our story, so we don't tell it. And when we don't tell someone a story, we prevent something from a shared experience happening. We may think that, oh, they're mad at us, so, I don't need to check in with them. We assume that someone's being distant. So, you know what? I'm just going to ghost them back. I'm like, if they're being distant, I'm going to be distant, right? We don't find out that maybe something's going on there. And this shows up in every place, right? Think about the workplace. You assume that your colleagues are unmotivated, but maybe they're actually dealing with a mental health spiral. Maybe they're exhausted. Maybe something's going on at home. In our friendships, you assume that someone is being distant, but maybe they're grieving something that they haven't said out loud. Maybe they're not ready to share something. Maybe they're feeling really vulnerable. Maybe they're afraid. They don't know how to share something. Maybe their personality is where they hibernate a little bit more. In our society, you see, someone's zip code, you see an accent, you see a skin tone, and your conditioning starts filling in the rest. This is how stereotypes get born, right? This is how bias hardens. This is how empathy disintegrates. And we're doing it on autopilot because that's what our brains need. Our brains need to filter this information. So you see someone, you see them driving a certain car, you see them dressed a certain way. Immediately, your brain starts to make assumptions about who they are, what their profile is, what they probably feel, what their politics are. Immediately, you start making these assumptions, and slowly these walls start coming up. So now, instead of being able to just get to know them as a human and say, wow, I learned something here today, or wow, I would have never approached that person if I would have thought that they belong to a different kind of community, or, we didn't share some like-minded belief systems or whatever it may be, right? But when we allow those assumptions to get in the way, we prevent ourselves from making these assumptions. This is where I host these changemaker dinners. I've been doing it for the last year and a half. And one of the number one rules that I have at those dinners is that you're actually not allowed to ask the question, what do you do? And I do that on purpose because what that does is if there's an economist, if there's a nonprofit founder, if there's a social worker, if there's an entrepreneur, if they're all sitting around, right? And let's just say there's a doctor, there's a politician there. Now they're all sitting around and they're already know, oh, what do you do? Oh, I'm a politician. Oh, all right. I know exactly where they are going to stand on things. I know exactly where they're going to believe before we've even approached them and understood anything. I had a dinner that I held once, which I thought was so powerful. At the dinner was a Black woman who's an atheist, was a Muslim man who's a human rights lawyer, was a nonprofit founder who's a Jewish woman. Me, I was there. I consider myself spiritual, but grew up in a Hindu home. I'm Indian. Another nonprofit founder who's a white male Christian. And nobody at that table knew anything about what they did for work or about, elements of their background. And here they were having deep conversations, learning about each other. I facilitated it in a way where we talked about childhood, we talked about parenting, we talked about what it's like to be childless, we talked about what it's like to grow up in different parts of the world. And there were so many beautiful relationships and connections that were made in that moment because they allowed themselves to connect beyond what we do. And that's what's really important is that if we allow our brain to go on autopilot, we'll actually see a lot more divisions happening because it's just the way that we biologically need to categorize so we can move forward. But that's where, when we don't allow ourselves to pause, what we're doing then is that we're building little bunkers of unspoken tension. We call it boundaries when it's really just a lot of fear, it's hurt, it's grief, and it's a lot of unprocessed feelings that are sitting around us that then come out in different bursts that we're like, where did this come from? And it's because it's unprocessed. And we do it because it feels good in the moment and it's protecting our peace. But we're not actually protecting our peace. We're quietly avoiding each other. It's easier in this world when there seems to be more chaos. In an earlier episode of Reframing Perspectives, I had interviewed Amina, Altai, and Samantha, and we explored what it meant to have double standards and identity show up in our lives. And one thing that we circled back to was this. We talked about those narratives that we use to protect ourselves in the current sense of self. And even those narratives are distorted because they're coming from some form of assumptions that we've made. And instead of asking, we sit in those because the answer might actually change everything for us. Because if we knew the real reason, we might have to act differently. We'd have to take accountability. And maybe we have to grieve. Maybe we'd have to grow. And that can be really, really hard. It isn't easy to actually go to someone and say, hey, I felt like something was off the other day when we had our conversation. It brings up that awkwardness and that uncomfortableness. So it's easier to swallow it and say, not that big of a deal. Water under the bridge, shove it under the rug. I'm not going to deal with that because why bother? Well, sometimes that's coming from our own difficulty with actually dealing with the reality of what we might hear. And so we start building an entire narrative in our heads and we start, creating this reality that we're like, oh, well, that makes sense. Because again, our brains don't know the difference between reality and figment of imagination. So what we tell it is what it believes. So, for example, you stop talking to a friend that you talk to quite often, and suddenly it's gone from talking daily to maybe weekly to maybe like once or twice a month. And, it's just been, you've both gotten busy. But instead of thinking, like, what happened here? I haven't heard from this person in a while. Are they okay? Did something happen to them? We immediately make it about ourselves. And we wonder, are they mad at us? Are they, did I say something? We start ruminating about everything that might have happened that might have prevented them from wanting to talk to us again. So much of assumption making is really staying within the self consumed space of all this unhealed wounds that we have and that we struggle with being able to actually deal with. And so we don't reach out to that friend because we get nervous. We start thinking about every single thing, that has happened and what could have gone wrong. And then before you know it, weeks have gone by without reaching out. And now it's just plain awkward. Now it just feels weird. And then you find out, oh, they were just going through a really difficult time and they were processing this. And when they process things, they go inwards, they hibernate, they like to be alone. And that's how they deal with overwhelm. It had nothing to do with you. Or let's use another example. When you're at work and your boss changes your one on one meeting to a Friday or Thursday evening when it's typically on a Monday or Tuesday morning. And oh, does this bring up a lot? Everyone immediately starts wondering, right? I'm getting fired. What did I do? Let me keep a paper trail. Let me go through all my emails. I can't sleep. I'm having so much anxiety. How dare my boss do that? Well, to be honest, that is a fair concern when something like that happens. So if you are a boss, if you are someone who is a leader and you are changing those meetings to a Thursday or Friday, my humble request is that you actually, in the note of change, say, don't worry, nothing's wrong. I needed to change it just for time's sake. Let the person know, give them context so that they're not going to be in that space of making assumptions. That is literally one of the hardest things that could happen to someone, especially when your job and your livelihood relies on it. So with work, it is a little bit more difficult than it is with friendships. With friendships, with family, you can kind of take the distance. But you find out in these moments that it's a lot of times it has nothing to do with us. Assumptions, I will say it again and again, it really gets under my skin because it really does cause so many miscommunications and challenges. And it can be so deeply stressful because we lose connection, community, relationships over this. And it continues to lead me back to thinking, what's going on with our society, our communities, our social structures that make assumptions so prominent? And how many connections are we cutting off or preventing? And how many more relationships are we going to continue to cut off because of a story that we've told ourselves and because we're too afraid to go there and communicate and share and heal those unhealed wounds that we have? And so I start observing this a little bit more. And I start noticing how many people start stories with disclaimers. They say things like, oh, this is probably stupid, but, or, you probably don't care about this, but I know this isn't your thing, but I just have to share. It probably is nothing, but, and I'm sure you can think of so many more. And it hit me. It's the language. That's not apathy. It's not about being nonchalant. When we think that we're saying things like that, oh, it's not that big of a deal, but, I know it's really stupid. And we think that we're just being so like, oh, we're just so chill. We're so like, oh, it's not a big deal. But what that really is armor. It's a protection measure. It's a way of us managing our social anxiety, of avoiding potential rejection, of softening the blow in case the other person doesn't meet you with care. So it's like, oh, yeah, yeah, you know what? That was stupid. That was stupid. Right? It's a self soothing tactic, especially when we've experienced so much letdown or when we haven't felt safe to express ourselves.
Hi, so I'm pausing the episode for a quick moment and for a quick favor. If you haven't already, if you could just click subscribe, leave a review wherever you're listening to this episode, it would be really helpful. The only way we can know to make sure that we provide the right type of podcast episodes, the right type of guests, and to make sure that we're delivering the type of content that you actually want to hear, it's through your reviews and through your support. Thanks, and now back to the episode.
So, what I'm saying is that using that kind of language, it's normal and it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just recognizing where it's coming from. Like when we say, let me give you an out before I get hurt. That's what we're trying to say here. Or when I zoom out, I have to ask myself, where is this tension coming from? Where is this language that we built, really being placed here? Is it specific to women? Have we been conditioned to pre-apologizing for taking up space? But the thing is that I know men who do this too. I just finished a Be Seen as a Leader program that I have for, organizations where a lot of men were talking about this as well. So then is it a cultural element? Is it a collectivist versus individualistic approach? But the thing is that I know people in both types of communities that behave this way. One definitely more than the other. I will say that people who do come from a collectivist culture definitely have a harder time asking questions for clarity because you're rewarded for keeping the peace, right? People in individualistic societies are more rewarded for asking direct questions. But people exist in all of this. So what is it? Where preserving harmony was praised and asking too many questions was considered disruptive. Maybe it's in both. Maybe it's like, where does this all come from? But what I realized is that, again, when you come down to it, it's a natural human thing. We're all walking around as humans craving for connection, but we're scared to initiate it. We want to be seen, we want to be felt and heard and supported, but we downplay what matters to us just in case it's too much, that it's too expressive, that's too emotional. And what happens is that when someone is expressive, when someone is emotional, when someone is asking for that care and those words of affirmation or that hug that we need, sometimes when we ask it in groups that aren't comfortable with vulnerability and they shut it down, then that prevents us from wanting to connect. I mean, this happens with men all the time, right? Men have a hard time expressing their feelings. We have conditioned societally that as a man, especially in the previous generations, that expressing feelings is not considered manly. So because it's not considered manly, now they have to find a way internally to process whatever is coming up for them, even if that may mean that, you know what, I'm just going to keep my distance now, right? And so the cost of this is that we never get to truly feel close to each other. And see, like for me, I grew up in a culture where making the peace is rewarded. But what that often meant was don't ask too many questions, right? The older generation, if you think about boomers, they would talk about how you're not supposed to, you're supposed to respect your elders. You don't ask your parents questions. You don't stir the pot, and so that gets passed down. And so in a world like that, assumptions becomes how you navigate social etiquette because you become predictors of what's okay without any clues. And you just have to be on high alert. Okay, I think this is okay here. I think that's okay here. How do I navigate myself here? Because how do I ask questions? See, because if I ask questions and ask for clarity of an elder, of a leader, it's considered disrespectful. Something that, like I mentioned earlier, the boomer generation really embodied. Because clarity can disrupt the illusion of peace. Why? Because you might make the person you're asking for clarity feel embarrassed. right? Because they aren't comfortable with the conversation. So, because they don't have the tools on how to navigate difficult conversations or never really were held accountable before, and now here you are asking questions and they're maybe getting anxious. So, because of that, and because of how then they may project back on us, we're afraid of their emotional response. So, we stop asking questions. And now we have this responsibility to someone else's emotional navigation. And there's been so many times, I'm sure you've heard this, that, oh, you know what? I'm not confrontational. And what happens is that the person who doesn't want to directly address the elephant in the room or the uncomfortable truth is gaslit. Because what happens here is that because you're the person who's like trying to actually clarify something and ask, but somebody else doesn't have the tools in how to process that difficult conversation, or when you're trying to highlight something that may have happened that was uncomfortable, then what happens is, they'll say, well, you know what? I'm just not a confrontational person. And immediately that shuts the other person down. So when you're in that kind of environment, naturally you're going to make assumptions and say, you know what? I'm not even going to bother asking because it's not necessarily a safe space for me to ask questions. It's not a safe space for me to have that. And this is where language plays a massive role in how we experience expression, in how we experience and how then we rely on our assumptions instead of actually clarifying anything. Because when you hear the word confrontation, it immediately signals, oh, there's going to be a fight. Roll up those sleeves. It's about to get messy. Literally, like that is what you probably think, right? And I laugh about this because whenever someone says that, like, oh, I'm not confrontational, I said, oh, okay, well, I didn't realize that we're about to go into a boxing ring and fight it out. I genuinely teach this in my program, Be Seen as a Leader, because if we replace the word confrontation with conversation, just pause for a moment with that and think about what happens there. When you pause there and you say, oh, I'm not confrontational. Yeah, the word confrontation brings up a lot. It means that there's going to be a disagreement, there's going to be tension. But when we say something like, hey, you know what? Let's have a conversation about what happened earlier. I'd love to have a conversation and share how much I do care about, what's going on with you. That word replacement, a conversation, is two people coming together to discuss, to share, to express. It doesn't feel as harmful, right? It doesn't feel as challenging. So, because we use the word confrontation, it becomes our safety guard to prevent from actually talking or expressing ourselves. And we do this because of how we grew up, what was conditioned, what was okay, what society has deemed. I mean, let's talk about corporate America, right? Corporate America is all about like going around the bush versus just being direct. So instead, we tell ourselves stories and we fill in the blanks with our best guess and carry the emotional weight of never really knowing the truth because we never have the capacity to hold that weight. And that emotional weight that we're carrying then, it doesn't disappear. It builds, and it builds resentment and it builds distance. And suddenly that person that you had a great relationship with, it feels now uncomfortable in your head in being in the same room. They may not even be thinking anything, but you've decided, oh my gosh, did you feel the tension? All of this happens because we're too afraid to say, hey, is everything okay? How are you really doing? Can we talk about what's really going on here? I don't even like to lead with, hey, are you mad at me? Or did I hurt you? And I don't lead with that because I don't want to make an assumption that it's about me. I want to check in with the other individual. This shows up in our communities, in our politics, in our workplaces. It shows up everywhere. We assume someone is unmotivated. Maybe they're actually burnt out, but we haven't asked them. Maybe we assume that someone's not smart, or maybe they never felt safe to speak up, or they're in the wrong industry. We assume that someone's too emotional, but maybe they just never have been allowed to show emotion without being punished for it. And so now they've hardened themselves, and we think that they don't have it in them. And what I know to be fact is that we make assumptions not because we're being careless, but because we're not ready necessarily to face our own truth. And more than often, that's really the reason why we're not going to talk about what happened. We're not going to ask questions. We're not going to share that story because we assume that someone didn't like us because maybe they actually did, but we pushed them away. Maybe we assume that someone else had it easier because we don't want to confront the privilege that we hold in whatever capacity that is. And we may assume that we are being judged, but it's really because deep down, we're the ones still judging ourselves and being critical of ourselves. So it's not laziness, it's not self-preservation. Because if we ask the real question, if we actually said, hey, what's really going on here? How are you feeling? I've noticed a distance. I want to make sure everything is okay. And then it comes out and we are able to say, did I hurt you? Was there something that I said that was offensive? Then that means that we might actually have to sit with some really uncomfortable answers and answers that could either disrupt our identity, could disrupt our belief system, answers that could force us to feel grief or guilt. And we don't want to feel those things. So that's where it's easier to make those assumptions. And so the false hope of assumptions is to give us temporary safety and long-term distortion because they help us avoid the truth until we're ready to confront it. But the longer that we wait, the harder it becomes to know what's real. And the more walls we build between us and the people that we love, between us and who they really are, the more then that we stretch ourselves and break ourselves. And they don't just stay in our heads, these assumptions and these belief systems. They live in our bodies. Every time that you say, you know what, I'll just let it go. Or every time you say, it's probably nothing. Every time you say that, you know what, I don't want to make a big deal out of it. It's not a big deal. It doesn't go anywhere else. It stays. It's that tension that you hold on to. It's that uneasiness and that sudden pang of anxiety or that pit in your stomach that you're feeling or the tightness that you're feeling in your chest. When you replay those conversations or when you replay that emotional response, that emotional weight of what hasn't been said is what you're feeling. And so then every time you're in that room with that person and it's there, you're feeling those things. You're avoiding a conversation, and that doesn't erase the discomfort. Avoiding a conversation doesn't erase the discomfort you're feeling. It transfers it and it gets buried within your body, and that ultimately severs that relationship. And stacked on top of every other little moment that you never cleared up until suddenly a small thing like a tone, a delay, or a look, it feels huge. It feels too much to carry. And it's not about being too sensitive. That's not what it is. It's because your nervous system has been keeping score of every time that you've swallowed something down. And then your brain and your body is remembering conditioning that this is the way that we navigate challenging moments, even if they were never meant to be challenging in the first place. And that's especially true for people who were raised in cultures or families where expression wasn't encouraged or where it was punished, where keeping the peace was the highest virtue and being good meant being agreeable. And your truth becomes negotiable if it made others uncomfortable. So all of this emotional weight that we carry, it doesn't disappear just because we ignore it. It stays with us and it builds. And so when we have these other relationships that are relatively new to us, what we're doing is we're taking some of those old stories that we've built up and now we're placing it into those new relationships. And then we wonder, why is it so hard to build community? Why is it so hard for us to build and deepen our relationships? Why is it that I can only go so far in a relationship before it just stays there and plateaus? And that's the cost of living in assumptions because we carry this weight of misunderstandings alone. And We sit in this by ourselves. And when they were never meant to be carried alone at all, and they were never even meant to be something that needed to create some kind of distance. So, another example, right? You're at a dinner with a friend and they say something offhand, a comment that just really stings you, but you don't say anything to them. And you assume that, you know what, they didn't mean it. It's not a big deal. You smile and you just carry on and spend the rest of the night questioning if you're just being too much. If you were to have said, hey, didn't really love that comment that you made about me, right? Or let's just say that, your partner forgets something important and they do it again and again. So you assume that it's because they don't care. You don't bring it up to them because you don't want to nag. You're always nagging. So you don't want to nag. But now there's a silent tally running in your head about all the things that they're not doing that makes you think that they don't care. And now you start withdrawing from them without even realizing it. And so then that withdrawal creates distance. And now no one's actually answering or talking about the thing that's really rooted in worrying about it. And you take that on into feeling like it doesn't matter. And then one day when that relationship has severed, you're like, wow, we've just grown apart. And I don't know why. And every time it happens, it chips away at your confidence. It chips away at feeling happy. So when a friendship starts to fade, the text messages start to slow down, the invitations go down from you and them. And you assume that, you know what? I guess this friendship has fizzled out. It's done its piece. And you pull back as well. What happens is, again, we are creating a form of quiet avoidance. We're carrying our own private stories about what happened, and we're not acknowledging it. No clarity, no closure, just moving right on with some quiet avoidance. And because that's what assumptions do, they whisper stories into our ears and curate this entire narrative that is truly self-protection, but feels an awful lot like loneliness. And another layer that I'd been thinking about from all of this is that sometimes we assume that someone doesn't care about us because they don't ask us questions, that we're telling them stories and they're not bothered by it. They just stay quiet. And we wonder, why are they not asking questions? Why are they not following up? They don't dig deeper. So then we fill in the gap with a story that if this person really cared, they would ask me. They would, I shared something vulnerable. They're going to ask me more questions. If it mattered to them, they'd bring it up with me. They'd follow up with me. Hey, you remember when you told me about this thing that hurt you? How are you doing with that now? But what if they're not asking because they were raised in an environment where being direct was seen as being rude? Asking questions were seen as being imposing. And so them not asking those questions, and maybe they were shut down at some point before. They were told that those things are too personal. You don't go there with someone. You let the person come to you. So what if their silence isn't indifference, but it's caution, it's respect, maybe even it's a little bit of fear? We don't always consider that the other person might be sitting in their own past wounds, and that's what's showing up. We're so in our own spaces, in our own heads, and that's where those assumptions, again, continue to just build this narrative that's a form of protection. And now we think that this person doesn't actually care, but really, what if it's just that they just don't want to impose? They're respecting your privacy, and they don't want to be intrusive. So again, in those moments, and we say to them, hey, you know what? I actually would really appreciate it if you would ask me questions. That gives them the green light that, oh, okay, it's safe over here. Because sometimes the people who seem disinterested are the ones that are trying the hardest to not overstep boundaries. And assumptions can create those spaces where we think that, we're being quietly robbed of closeness. So I've started to do something small, and I encourage all of you to as well try this. It's really, really powerful. Every time someone leads with, you know what? I know you probably don't care about this. I stop them. I pause them and I say, actually, I do care because you do. Or I'll say, you know what? You're right. I'm not a pet owner, but I love learning what lights you up. So keep going because this moment made you happy. And as a friend, I care. It's gentle, it's honest. Every time that we do it, what we're doing by telling someone, you know what? Actually, I do care, is that we build a little bit more safety into our friendships. And because we show up in this way, and I show up because I care about my friends, I learn about how much this friend with her pet, her dog, has helped her with some of her most difficult moments in her life. And more than the pet, I learned about those moments. I learned about what was being really challenging. What I find a lot of times is that a friend, when they're sharing a story, and specifically this one, when sharing a story about how her dog was uplifted her spirits after what she had just been going through and brewing underneath a lot of discomfort and kind of a lot of sadness. What I was learning is about, oh, there was this thing that happening in her life, and I'm now learning how I can be a better friend. So many of the challenges that we carry in these relationships aren't because we don't love or respect each other. It's because we stopped expressing. And expression does require safety. It absolutely does. That's why when someone says to you, I know you're not going to care, just pause them and say, you know what? I actually might. Share with me, you know? So when practicing this, start with the safest friends. Start with the friend who'll hear you when you say, I actually do care. Can we talk about that weird moment earlier? I think I made up a story in my head. Can we just check in about it? Start with that friend that you truly feel safety around. So when you start practicing this, it's not going to feel uncomfortable because those small check ins, they're what keep our relationships alive, not assumptions. Those check ins, those moments, those places where you can tell someone, hey, I actually do love that. Or like, thank you so much for sharing that. It makes me so happy to see you so like lit up, right? And these are the things that can actually help us, help our community, help our society come together, especially right now.
I really hope that you enjoy this episode. And I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode. And thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.